Hello, my name is Adam, and this is my first video that I'm making for BookTube where I'm talking about my favorite nonfiction books. Today I'd like to discuss my top 10 favorite nonfiction books that I've read up to this point in my life. I wanted to make a video of this just to chronicle my top 10 list of my favorite nonfiction books that I read. I've been reading a lot of nonfiction. I'm a history and literature teacher, and I enjoy reading nonfiction quite a bit. And at this point in my life, I'd like to make a list and see, maybe come back and look at this in maybe a couple of years or 5 years and see how it remains the same or if it's changed at all. So without any further ado, I hope that you enjoyed this video. And when you're done watching this video, if you'd like to share with me some of the favorite nonfiction books you might think I've missed, or have any comments about any of the books that I do mention in my list, then please let me know, and I'd be happy to hear from you. So let's get straight away into this list. Let's start talking about my top 10 favorite nonfiction books. So let's begin. I've always been a pretty big sports fan during my whole life, so I'm going to start off book number 10 with my favorite sports book that I've read, and that is The Boys of Summer by Roger Kahn. And so this book was written in the early 70s, and it actually starts a little bit slow. It's a book about the Brooklyn Dodgers and the great teams that they had in the early 1950s. And some of the people who are chronicled in this book, of course, Jackie Robinson, but then you also hear the stories of players like Pee Wee Reese and Carl Furillo, Duke Snyder, Joe Black, Carl Erskine, Roy Campanella. And one of the things that I learned from reading this book was how great of a catcher Roy Campanella was, and how in the early 50s he had a couple of years where he was perhaps the best player in the whole entire game of baseball. And so, of course, later he's injured in a car accident, and so his career doesn't quite pan out to be as lengthy as some of the other all-time baseball greats. But what an amazing story of a team that really not only just bonded together as a team, but bonded together as a unit of men who enjoyed playing the game and really did grow to love each other. Like I said, the book starts a little bit slow. It took me a while to get into it, but once I got back about to the midpoint of this book, I was just enthralled in their story. And of course, Roger Kahn does a great job of telling of the tales that the Dodgers had and how they were always going for that elusive goal of trying to overcome the New York Yankees and be the best team in baseball. And they played the Yankees in several World Series in the early to mid 1950s. And then the year finally came in 1955 when they won it all and they were able to overcome the New York Yankees. So what a great sports rivalry that was for baseball. But the best part of the book is the end. And at the end, after these players have retired and they've moved on to other avenues in their life, the book just gets phenomenal. It just talks about the relationships that these players had with each other and just how they really loved each other. They saw each other as brothers. And it's definitely my favorite part of the book, just the way that Roger Kahn captures that feeling of the boys of summer in the prime of their life. They're playing a sport that they love, but then looking back in the relationships that they had and the memories that they made with each other, and just the way that they grew together as men is just my favorite part of the book by far. And that is what makes it the best sports book that I have read. Okay, I don't want to take too long on any one of these books. So moving on to number 9. This is a massive book. It's called Our Oriental Heritage by Will Durant. So this is book 1 in a series of 11 nonfiction history books that were written by Will Durant, and then later on his wife Ariel became a co-author with him, and so they wrote 11 of these all together. I've only read this one all the way through. I have read quite a bit of the Rousseau and Revolution book that comes much later in the series. I'm not finished with that one yet, though, so I didn't want to include it on my list. But if you read all 11, that would be quite a lot of reading. And this is the only one that I've read completely through, but it is very, very good. This is an older book. Durant completed writing this book in 1935. And so some of this information in the book might seem like it's a little bit outdated, but actually as I was reading through this book, I didn't find too much that I thought, wow, this doesn't hold up anymore. I was really actually kind of surprised about how insightful he was and how the material that he found has largely been still still relevant today and still important for readers to understand today. So Durant writes in a very, and this is, you'll notice that I mentioned this several times in the video, that Durant writes in a way that's very accessible for the reader. So he's not one of these boring historians, or he's not one of these people who just specializes in, one certain aspect of history, and then unless you have a real fascination with that aspect of history, you could care less about the book. And so this is kind of an overview of the Oriental civilizations. That's kind of an outdated word in itself, but what we're talking about is we're talking about East Africa. We're talking about the Middle East. So civilizations like Egypt, civilizations like Persia, Babylon, the Assyrians, and then he moves farther east into to India and China, and then finishes the book with Japan. And so again, this is written in 1935. So he's looking at early Eastern civilizations up to the time period of the 30s, and he kind of does just an overview, of course, but he does really, really tell some wonderful tales. And so you learn about people like in India, you learn about the emperors Chandragupta and Ashoka. In China, you learn about Emperor Shi Huangdi and the Han Dynasty. And so you just learn about why these civilizations flourished and what was so fantastic about each of these civilizations. In Babylon, you learn about Hammurabi and the Hanging Gardens and how the Hanging Gardens came to be. He talks a little bit about the engineering that needed to be possible for that to happen. In Persia, he talks about King Darius and how he came to Egypt, conquered Egypt, and then he had a canal built to connect the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And so he just does a fantastic job of telling these wonderful stories, and the stories that are very interesting for historians to learn about, and people who love learning about history as well. Okay, I do plan on reading some of the other books in Durant's series, but I probably won't read all 11. If I live long enough and have enough spare time to read, then perhaps I would. Book number 8 is Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. So Jon Krakauer has read a lot of nonfiction books that are worth reading. From what I hear, I've only read this book by him. And it is an amazing book. And so it talks about the 1996 expedition to Mount Everest. Krakauer was a writer for Outside Magazine. And so he was, his fee to go to Everest was paid by the magazine. And it just so happened to be that was the year that they had the most deaths on Mount Everest of any year, any climbing year that they've ever had. And Krakauer is there to tell the story, and it is quite a story. And so this is a story that's pretty well known. And so if you've read a book about this or seen the movies, then you know the story. So just in the small group of expeditions that were kind of with him at the same time that he was going up, some about 10 people died on the expedition. And one of the things that's just interesting, of course, he tells the whole story from the beginning to the end of the climb, and the time that it takes to go over to Nepal and get the permits and climb up the mountain and set up base camp and then ascend up to the top of the mountain, and then just kind of what makes the people who are on this expedition, what makes them want to do something like this, and how are they able to persevere despite a lot of odds against them. Of course, the extreme cold weather, the high winds, the lack of oxygen. And then he goes into great detail about how your brain starts to slow down and your body starts to not work the way that you want it to. So just your motor skills are really depleted when you're that high up in elevation. And so, of course, and he talks about, how the people, what exactly happened to lead to so many deaths on this expedition. And it's a harrowing story, and it's a sad story. And I feel bad that these people lost their lives. The story of the Japanese female climber Yasuko Namba, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, how she was, in desperate need of help, and these people were so close to her, and yet they couldn't help her because physically they were just so depleted. Mentally, they were so depleted, and they couldn't offer help, even though they were just feet away from her. And, they had the ability to help her, but they just didn't, maybe, but they just weren't able to help her down the mountain. And then it talks also the really heartwarming story of a climber. His name was Beck Weathers, I think that's what his name was, and he was in a real poor condition, and he had extreme frostbite. And then later on, I believe that his arm was amputated, but he was able to survive. And just the optimism that he had after he came down from the whole Everett experience is it's a heartwarming tale. So very sad, upsetting story, but in some ways there's also a cause for feeling a little bit of optimism about what happened on the mountain there. So just a gripping, well-told tale. Number 7 is another history overview, kind of in the vein of Will Durant. My number 7 book is Paul Johnson's A History of the American People. And so you can see this is a pretty big book too. And so he just writes the story of America's history. He's a British author. He is, I will let you know that he is a conservative author. So for those of you guys who maybe your politics lean a little bit more to the liberal side, perhaps you might become infuriated with parts of the book. I tend to be a moderate, and I know that's not too common in America at this time period right now, but I really like, and this will come up again when I talk about more history books further down the list. I really like writers who are able to make history almost like literature, and that's what Johnson does. But nonfiction literature, of course. Johnson, he's a great writer. He has a way of making his prose come to life. He has a way of just structuring his ideas and thoughts and his paragraphs and his words and his sentences into something that makes enjoyable reading. And I really like that. And he does a lot of research where he comes up with these little nuggets of history. Even though I'm a history teacher and I've told these stories of these people for many, many years, he's able to draw new things out of his research that I didn't know. And so even though I know this story, he was able to surprise me with his little insights. As he gets a little bit farther into the book and you get to more current times, there are times when you're like, okay, I'm not sure I agree with your perspective on this, Paul Johnson, but he does an admirable job of giving facts and details and information. There's lots of statistics in the book. He uses a lot of data to support the claims that he is making. So I really enjoyed Paul Johnson's read. I've read a couple of his other books, A Quest for God and the book he wrote on Napoleon. Both of those books were pretty brief. And so I'd like to read another one of John. Oh, and I did read Paul Johnson's book on King Edward III, which was one of his first books that he wrote a long time ago. I would like to read one of his longer books again to see if it's as enthralling as this one. My number 6 book, I'm going to include this. This is of all the books that I've read on this list. This is the one that I read first in my life. It's a book by Allan Eckert. It's called The Frontiersmen, and it's was written in the 1967, although I read this when I was in high school back in the late 80s. So this is a series of books called The Winning of America, and they're narratives of how the English colonists moved across the American frontier, and they displaced the Native Americans, and they took over North America from the Native Americans. It's narrative nonfiction because Eckert does a thing where he tells you what the person is thinking and how they're feeling, and you wonder, well, is this true or is he just writing a story? And so he claims that everything that he says is true. And so he did a lot of research. He read a lot of primary sources and a lot of letters back and forth between people from this time period. And then he just created the situation, the story. So I'm not sure that, academic historians, again, would really be supportive of this, but it makes for engrossing narrative nonfiction. And so the main character in this book is a couple of the main characters. One is Simon Kenton, who I think is portrayed here on the front, being the frontiersman. But then also it talks a lot about the Shawnee Indian chief Tecumseh. And it talks about how, and I have to say that Allan Eckert, the way that he writes about Tecumseh makes him one of my favorite people to read about in all of American history. He just really shows him as being fabulous American, one of the greatest Americans of all time. And so it's just a really interesting story about how, especially like in Kentucky and Ohio, that area was settled, and the English who settled it coming over from the East Coast, they displaced the Shawnee tribes, and how Tecumseh was trying to get his people to resist the westward expansion of the white Americans and his people having to lose their land. And so it's just a really gripping story. One thing that I will say about this book that I want to be accurate about is that there are a couple of sections in this book, and then also later in his other books as well, where it's extremely graphic. So he doesn't spare any of the gory details about what could happen when the Europeans and the natives came into conflict with each other. And barbarism, of course, was on both sides, and he portrays that in his book. There's a couple of sections in here where it's extremely graphic brutality, and it was almost enough to make me sick. And I was just like, wow, this is really, really graphic. They generally only last a couple of pages, but it can be extremely graphic. And so just be aware of that. But a great first book of a series. And I've also read Wilderness Empire, I've read The Conquerors, and I've read Wilderness War, which are the next three books that come after this one. But of the four that I've read so far, this is my favorite. Okay, number 5. That was book number 6. Moving on to, that's right, number 5. A political biography about President Theodore Roosevelt, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, written by Edmund Morris. This book was published in 1979, and it did win the Pulitzer Prize. So it tells the story of Teddy Roosevelt's early career. And so this stopped short of his presidency, not including the time that he was president of the United States, but everything up to that point in his career. And so what an interesting character Theodore Roosevelt is. And if you know anything about him, you know that his life was extremely interesting. But he went through a lot. And so, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, so to speak, he endured the loss of his mother and his wife on the very same exact day while living in New York City. And then it goes on to tell the story of how he moved out west for a while. He was a farmer/rancher in North Dakota for a while. He came back to New York to begin his political career. It talks about his time in the state legislature. Actually, that was before he went out to North Dakota, but it talks about his time in the state legislature in Albany. It talks about his brief time that he was the mayor of the police force in New York City, that the chief of the police force in New York City. Talks about his brief time as governor, talks about his brief time as vice president. Of course, it talks about the time he went down to Cuba, fought in the Spanish-American War. And so Edmund Morris is just a great writer, and he just really brings out Teddy Roosevelt's story and just really brings it to life. It's a great, great political biography, and I just enjoyed reading it. Morris is an incredible writer. He really brought his subject to life. I would say that it's my favorite biography that I've ever read, but just by a little bit, just by a hair. There's one I like a little bit better, and that's my number 4 book, and that is Master of the Senate, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, by Robert Caro. This is the third book that Robert Caro has written about the life of Lyndon Johnson. Since this book has been published, and you can see that this one also won the Pulitzer Prize, since this book has been published, Caro has written in book number 4 of Lyndon Johnson's life, which I have not read yet. And actually, of the 4, this is the only one that I've read. Book number 4, I think, covers the years that Johnson was vice president. And then I think that as long as Caro can still stay alive and complete his book, I think there's going to be one more volume about the years that Johnson was president. Although you can see this is a pretty thick book, and Robert Caro is thorough, if nothing else. So maybe the Lyndon Johnson presidency book, I'm not sure, but maybe it's going to have to be broken down into 2 volumes. This is a fantastic book about the time that Lyndon Johnson was in the United States Senate, and he rose to the position of being Senate Majority Leader. This is during the years when FDR and Truman are presidents, and then into the Eisenhower years as well. And so this covers just a lot of information about Lyndon Johnson. It's a great book. Caro is a fantastic writer. He brings the time period to life. He brings the subject Lyndon Johnson to life, but it's much more than that. It's really kind of a history of the U.S. Senate during the 1900s. And so he talks quite a lot about what's going on in the Senate, just besides Lyndon Johnson. And so he spends a lot of time talking about a senator from Georgia named Richard Russell. And so those of you guys who have been to Washington, D.C. or may know a little bit about the U.S. Senate, so the Russell Office Building is one of the buildings that houses the congressmen in the United States. And so it was named for Richard Russell. And he was an interesting person in political history. And so a Southern congressman during the time period in the 30s when when the New Deal legislation from President Roosevelt was trying to reform the nation. And then as segregation becomes a big issue in the 50s, and that's what this book talks about quite a bit, is that the Southern Democrats, of course, are trying to resist the desegregation of the South, I should say. I hope I didn't mess that up. They're trying to resist the desegregation of the South, and so Russell and his Southern Democrat cronies are blocking any civil rights legislation that's being pushed through Congress. And of course, Johnson becomes a champion for that. And Caro talks about that too, why Johnson, even though he's a Texan, Southern Texan himself, why he is in favor of civil rights. And it just talks about how he's trying to get those programs implemented, and how Johnson got to that place where he would want to do that himself. And so, yeah, it's just a great story. Okay, let's move on. We're up to book number 3, and book number 3 is the oldest of the books that, in terms of when it was published on my list, and it goes all the way back to the 1500s. It is called The Bondage of the Will, and it is by the Protestant theologian Martin Luther. And so Luther started the Protestant Reformation. A lot of Luther scholars and just religious scholars in general think that this is Martin Luther's best book that he wrote, and so he wrote this in 1525. So 8 years after the Reformation started. And so it's really in-depth dive on the idea of free will. And so there was a theologian, Desiderius Erasmus, who wrote a book about the freedom of the will. And so Luther was responding to Erasmus's idea of the freedom of the will, and he writes a book called The Bondage of the Will. It's a really heavy book on theology, and so if you ever want to know about man's relationship to God and man's relationship in where he stands in his own movement for salvation, Bondage of the Will, I think, is a must read. I know that when I read it, I had a pencil and I was just making notes and underlining and writing my own questions that I had. And I had a lot of questions, to be honest with you. The book was incredible, and it really gave a convincing argument, but it also raised a lot of questions. And so I've thought about free will a lot, and the relationship of a person's ability to work towards their salvation. Are they able to do that? Luther kind of takes this, so these ideas, and again, a lot of this, of course, goes back to the time period of St. Augustine, and when St. Augustine was writing against the other people like the British monk Pelagius. Luther talks a lot about that. Luther talks a lot about how he believes that St. Augustine had the right ideas and that we can't save ourselves. And so our will is in bondage to God. And so we have, of course, Luther would say we have free will in and of all things except for salvation. And so it's really an interesting thing. And again, I don't know where I stand for sure on this. This is something I always want to know more about. But it's just, I'm a person who thinks a lot about God and man's relationship to God. And so this book was very important in my life. It helped me understand a little bit more, or ask a little bit, or know which questions to ask as I try to understand a little bit more about man's relationship to God and his role in the whole salvation issue. Okay, moving on. We're down to book number 2. And for book number 2, I'm going to do a little bit of a cheat. I'm going to have 2 books tied for number 2, but I hope that you can see why I did this, and I can explain how these books are really they kind of go together. And so I've got The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11, written by Lawrence Wright, Pulitzer Prize winner, and I have that tied with 102 Minutes, The Untold Story of the Fight to Survive Inside the Twin Towers, written by Jim Dwyer and Kevin Flynn. And so these books, I think they go together. They're both great books, by the way. They're both very worthy of the reads by themselves. And they were interesting. They were both written about the same time, so 2005. And then this one, I believe, was written in 2005 as well. But then the paperback copy was in 2006 when it was published. National Book Award finalist. And so these are both great books by themselves. But if you read them together, you get the full idea of what was happening on September 11th. The Looming Tower, of course, gives you the background of Al-Qaeda and why they did what they did, why they thought it was necessary to attack the World Trade Center in Washington, D.C. on that fateful day that we all remember. Well, if we're old enough that we all remember pretty well. I know that I wanted to know a little bit more about the whole story, and so reading about Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, and why they formed Al-Qaeda and what their goals and purposes, what their motivations were. And so he talks a lot about the Wahhabi movement and talks about, Lawrence Wright gets you into the story right away. He gives you the background about the attack on the mosque in the mosque in Saudi Arabia. And so at the beginning of the book, and he just gives you all the background about that, and just draws you in with a really gripping tale, and he just helps you to understand who Al-Qaeda is and why they did what they did, and then how they were able to train so secretly for the attacks that they proposed on September 11th. And then, of course, the 102 minutes is the story of the time period in between when the first plane hit one of the Twin Towers in New York City, and then by the time both towers North Tower and South Tower had collapsed. The stories of the people who are inside the buildings, the stories of the people who are rescuing the survivors. It's an absolutely gripping story. And, there's tears and there's joy by reading this book, that it helps you understand what was happening to the people in New York. And just also, the authors talk a lot about the police and firemen and the way that they were heroes and what they did to rescue the people inside the Twin Towers, but then also what led up to them not really being able to communicate that well with each other on that day, and some of the reforms that have come out of the accidents that happened on that tragic and fateful day. So great book. So we are at last to my number one nonfiction book that I have ever read. This is one of my favorite nonfiction authors. I've read a lot of his books, but this one is my favorite. So it's David Halberstam, and the book is The 50s. And so this is what you would think about. It just talks about America in the 1950s, and he's telling the story of America during the 1950s. So Halberstam is a great writer. Again, he just writes in a way that's easy to understand and just draws you into the story. I've read several of his books. I read some of his sports books, like October 1964, a great book about the Cardinals and the Yankees in the World Series. I've read his book about the Portland Trailblazers because I live in Oregon myself, and so I wanted to read a book about the Portland Trailblazers. I also have read his book about, so he has some history books, this is a history book. War in the Time of Peace, I read that, which is about the American political situation in the 1990s. And I also read Firehouse, which tells his brief story about one crew on September 11th. But this is my favorite of his books that I've read, and it just tells you everything you would want to know about the 1950s, the cultural aspects of the 50s, the political aspects, what was going on in America at that time in business. And there was a lot of innovations in the 50s. He talks about the rise of the McDonald's restaurants, the rise of the Howard Johnson hotels. He talks about the TV shows that we were watching, like I Love Lucy back in that time period, the quiz show, debates. He talks about the movies that were being made. He talks about the tension between Marlon Brando and the people that he was working with when they were making On the Waterfront, Streetcar Named Desire. He talks about some of the novels that we were reading. Grace Metellus wrote Peyton Place in the 1950s. He talks about that. He talks about some of the civil rights issues that were happening, the murder of Emmett Till and how horrible that was. He talks about at the end of the decade, he talks about how Fidel Castro overthrew Batista and the United States response to that, the CIA invasion of Guatemala in the early 1950s. He talks about the political movement as well. And so it's just a great encapsulation of what was happening in the 1950s. Oh, and of course, I can't forget to mention that he does, of course, tell us a lot about Elvis Presley, too, in case you were wondering, how can you talk about the 50s and not mention Elvis Presley? So great book. And so of all the nonfiction books that I've read, I think this is the one that I really enjoyed the most. I just breezed right through it. So great story, too. So that's it. If you have any comments about anything that I said in this video, I'd love to hear back from you. If you have any nonfiction books that you think that I've missed, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much. And let me know if you like this video, and maybe I'll make another one, my top 10 favorite fiction books of all time or something like that. Have a great day. Bye.